Yes!
Every September/fall expansion in Destiny 2 is always what the Destiny community looks forward to the most, because this is when the biggest DLC release always happens every year. The Beyond Light expansion is a literal trendsetter due to being the first Destiny DLC to introduce a darkness subclass in the form of the element known as Stasis. And although it's pretty exciting to finally be able to wield the darkness and the light at the same time, Stasis has received some mixed feedback, and a huge chunk of the fan base is saying that it's overpowered in PvP and ruining the already lackluster Crucible experience. So yeah, let's go ahead and get it in. If you wanted to know the technical/logical terms, Stasis is a darkness element that represents the absence of energy, whereas the light elements represents the presence of energy. Another thing that I learned very recently is that the sensation of cold doesn't actually exist in the most literal sense, because when you're feeling cold, it's actually due to the absence of heat. Stasis is also the literal antithesis of solar light in the sense that fire is the opposite of ice, but I'm pretty sure you already knew that. So yeah, that's Stasis in a nutshell. But what exactly does it do? Well, the TLDR is that it freezes, stops things from moving, and many PvP players would even say that Stasis equates to an anti-fun experience in the Crucible. And to some extent, I understand why anybody would feel this way, because there are little to no response and or counter options to getting frozen. I'll get into all of that later, but at this moment, let's compare Stasis to the light elements. If you weren't already aware, the three elements of light consist of solar, arc, and void. And we had access to these elements of light for the past 6 years or so. And to be honest, things have been pretty simplistic. There's a lot of things that none of us ever thought about until Stasis came along. I'll explain what I mean. Now, due to the fact that stasis damage actually does something all the time, it's split up into two different attributes known as freezing and shattering. But shattering is pretty self-explanatory too. Basically, the process of shattering a target solely consists of you doing enough damage to them to cause their frozen form to shatter, thus killing them. These are dynamic extra effects that the light elements do not have their own answer or equivalent to. If they did, I would assume that solar damage will always cause burning damage over time, or arc would shock and slow a target's movement, for example. Well, this does happen some of the time, but not all of the time. And one of the main superlatives of the stasis element is that it either freezes or slows down anyone on the receiving end. This means that stasis is lethal all the time, no matter where it's coming from. Imagine if stasis was available in Destiny 1. The freezing effect would have probably been a perk that you would have to select as one of the subclasses perk nodes, meaning that freezing targets wouldn't be something you'd be able to do all the time. I'll give you an example. Back in D1, there was a perk node on the Warlock Sunsinker skill tree that would grant all solar ability damage the added buff of afflicting enemies with the Ignite debuff. And this ability was known as Viking Funeral. Ignited enemies would take burning damage over time and will receive a debuff that would increase all incoming damage. Now, Viking Funeral was incredibly powerful, and at one point in time it was nerfed because Sunsinger Warlocks literally ran Trials of Osiris, and they were incredibly difficult to compete against. Imagine surviving a slap to the face or a grenade explosion only to burn to death, because that's literally what Viking Funeral did. And again, this would be the solar damage equivalent to the freezing capabilities of stasis. And due to the fact that all solar damage wasn't capable of doing this, it wasn't something that you had to worry about all the time. But with all of this being stated, it makes me wonder how stasis is gonna work in the future. Right now, we have one stasis damage weapon in the form of the exotic heavy grenade launcher known as Salvation's Grip. Now, I haven't used this weapon much, but based on a little bit of time that I did use it, I found out that it fires projectiles that will encase enemies in ice. But what blew my mind the most is that since this weapon deals stasis damage, it's compatible with the stasis subclass aspects. Now, I had no idea that this was even a thing, but when I read the description for the ice flare bolts aspect, it stated that shattering a frozen target spawns seekers that track and freeze other nearby targets. This means that you don't even have to be the one that froze the enemies you shattered in the first place, and it doesn't matter how the opponent was frozen. I was in literal astonishment after finding this out, because there's never been a point in time in Destiny history where the light subclasses have been able to influence something that wasn't from its own abilities. The fact that Salvation's Grip benefits from the stasis subclass aspects would be no different in Sunshot proccing Viking Funeral that we spoke of previously. Sunshot is a solar hand cannon, and the Sunsinger subclass was a solar subclass, so how would this not be comparable? But now that we're on the subject, would it be outlandish to assume that we might eventually get legendary weapons that deal stasis damage? To some extent, yes, and I say this because I feel that stasis is so new to the game, and a lot of abilities might get nerfed and or adjusted over the course of year 4. Bungie played their cards right by, once again, introducing one weapon that deals stasis damage and made it exotic, since the water's still being tested with this new darkness element. Now, we have plenty of solar arc and void damage legendary weapons, but that's literally harmless because elemental weapons have only been useful when it comes to breaking elemental shields. But if we had stasis damage legendary weapons, every one of them would behave outside of the realm of capabilities and power fantasy of the other legendary elemental weapons. I'm referring to the fact that stasis is so unique as an element in regards to what it's capable of. A stasis damage legendary weapon will have a much higher usage incentive than an exotic stasis damage weapon, because if you had a weapon that could freeze and shatter opponents and still have a free exotic slot, why would you use an exotic weapon that does the same thing? This is exactly the same reason why pinnacle weapons were so powerful. They were legendary weapons that behaved the same, if not better than exotic weapons. And in my honest opinion, pinnacle weapons are the driving force of Bungie implementing sunsetting into the game. Nonetheless, I've learned to never say never when it comes to Bungie, because it's obvious that they'll always throw us for a loop. But if every stasis damage weapon released in the future is of the exotic rarity, it'll be the same reason why all trace rifles are exotic. Trace rifles don't differ too much from one another, but they're entirely too unique to not be of the exotic rarity. I wouldn't have been surprised if we had a pinnacle trace rifle, but the likelihood of that happening is none due to the fact that pinnacle weapons have been retired from the game. Now, what makes stasis so hated in PvP? If it's something that you haven't experienced for yourself, do me a favor and close your eyes and imagine popping your super at the perfect moment as the entire enemy team just spawned in within seconds of one another. You're about to get your first 7th column until all of a sudden you get hit by a stasis ability and frozen instantly. Now, even if you're somebody who is perfectly fine with how much stasis is affecting PvP, don't sit up here and lie to me and say that you wouldn't be mad if this happened to you, because you would be. And it's literally impossible that you've been able to avoid getting frozen in PvP since the Beyond Light DLC dropped. But due to the fact that stasis is the new kid on the block, it was inevitable that you would see everybody using it, because the newest things in the game always get the most play. Stasis is powerful, reliable, and simply put, it does things that the light subclasses aren't capable of. Stasis has given us a sense of power fantasy that set the bar too high for the light subclasses to reach. Not even simply because of the fact that the stasis element does a lot, but it's also because of the fact that the stasis subclasses have an actual sense of customization. You have the ability to select different aspects and fragments tailored to your playstyle and or how much of an annoyance you want to be to the enemy team. This is another superlative of the stasis subclasses that the light subclasses don't have, because they're still stuck in the top tree, middle tree, and bottom tree limited aspect of ability selection, which was both a horrible idea and an antiquated idea even back when Destiny 2 was brand new. Again, we did have the ability to customize subclasses back in D1, and the Destiny community was beyond upset when it was revealed that subclass customization wouldn't be present in Destiny 2 when it first came out. Bungie would have no choice but to update the light subclasses and give them the same customization freedom as stasis and the future darkness subclasses will have, in order to narrow the power fantasy gap between the light and the darkness subclasses. Now, it's inevitable that stasis abilities will become less powerful over time. Nonetheless, it's possible that no matter how many times the stasis abilities get nerfed, they'll still be more powerful and do more than the light subclasses. Stasis has made its mark in the game and set the precedent for how powerful abilities in the game should be. This, combined with the fact that stasis is brand new, are the cooperating contributing factors as to why any and everybody is using stasis over the light subclasses in PvP. However, PvE is an entirely different story though. For example, in raids, the old staples such as Well of Radiance and Water Dawn for boss DPS are still holding it down very well, and aside from being able to easily clear adds by freezing and shattering them, stasis hasn't really made its mark in PvE yet, mostly due to the fact that as of right now, the stasis element doesn't have any conventional support-based supers or abilities. And this makes sense because the darkness is represented entirely differently from the light. The light is in essence weaponized to protect and or defend, and in a literal sense, self-defense or self-protection can be exhibited by you preventing somebody from causing you bodily harm by guarding your person in any conceivable way, i.e. a shield or barricade, or by physically afflicting the opponent. This is why the light subclasses have offensive and defensive abilities, and as far as I'm concerned, there aren't any actual downsides to using a light. Whereas darkness represents reckless, raw power that can consume the user if their willpower isn't strong enough, and that's the main downside of the darkness, because in order to utilize it, your willpower has to be stronger than it. The darkness is obviously more powerful than the light, but the aforementioned downsides are fair trade-offs of utilizing something so unstable and strong. So in comparison, the light is your friend and will help you. The darkness is not your friend and will only bend to your will if you show it that you're stronger than it is. It's basically like raising a domesticated animal versus raising a wild animal. The light being a domesticated animal and the darkness being a wild animal. This is why the stasis subclasses wreak absolute havoc in PvP, and I couldn't see Bungie giving us a stasis equivalent to Well of Radiance or Water Dawn, for example. If Bungie decided decided to throw us all for a loop and do the exact opposite of that, support-based stasis abilities would have to do something along the lines of damaging opponents, or to heal yourself and or increase damage output, or to simply inconvenience the opponent to empower yourself in any way. Because there's nothing rejuvenating or consoling about the darkness, so it wouldn't make sense for us to just have support-based stasis supers or abilities without doing something to yourself or the opponent in order to receive some sort of benefit. A noteworthy example from another series would be the Abyssal Blade attack belonging to the Dark Knight class from Final Fantasy Tactics World Alliance. This attack does a ridiculous amount of damage, but using it will siphon some of your HP, and you would be crazy to disagree with the notion that an attack like this does an amazing job at paying homage to the concept of darkness, or what might come to mind when darkness is thought of. Another example would be the King's Fall Raid exotic scout rifle from Destiny 1, known as Touch of Malice. This weapon had the ability to regenerate the final round in its magazine, meaning that its ammo was indefinite, and the final round will always deal double damage in PvE. However, the downside is that you would take damage every time you fired the indefinitely regenerating final round. Touch of Malice was the first weapon in Destiny history that could damage its wielder, alongside being one of, if not the best examples of how a darkness-oriented weapon would behave. So yeah, I think I did a pretty good job at explaining how support-based stasis abilities will perform if they ever existed. The risk will be high, but the rewards will be just as high, and it makes sense when you're utilizing something so strong. Okay, we've come to the conclusion that Stasis is incredibly powerful, and it's more than fair to assume that its abilities will be tweaked, adjusted, or flat out nerfed over time because of how much better it is than most of the abilities that existed in the game pre-Beyond Light. But you might be curious to know how I personally feel about Stasis. Well, I'll go ahead and say that I'm happy that a darkness-based element has finally found its way into the game. I haven't really been playing Destiny 2 that often lately, but I completely understand and agree with the community's frustration with the overwhelming presence of Stasis in PvP. Destiny 2's PvP prioritizes movement and mobility over everything else, and Stasis is the complete opposite of that due to the fact that it freezes and slows you down if you're on the receiving end of it. Now, I've already found PvP enjoyable for a while now, but after being frozen a million times every match and not being able to do much to counter or respond, I simply quit PvP as a whole because I just wasn't enjoying myself at all. Bungie has made it evident that PvP is just an add-on to the game, and they don't really treat it with the same TLC that they give PvE. Well-known members of the PvP side of the Destiny community have publicly announced that they feel mistreated and not cared about, and have expressed their frustrations with the game alongside the fact that they might be putting the game down for good. And I don't blame them, because after feeling as if you've been ignored and swept under the rug for years on end, eventually you hit your breaking point and just say forget it. Unfortunately, Bungie can't make everybody happy, but it's a well-known fact that PvP has never been a part of the game that is received as much love as it should. In my opinion, Destiny 2's PvP has never been good because, remember, back in year 1, we were forced to use 2 primary weapons. All special and heavy weapons shared the same slot, and if you weren't team shooting, you weren't winning engagements because the time to kill was so slow. Now, over the last couple of years, Bungie has definitely stepped their game up and made PvP better, but I've never once felt that it was good. It simply went from horrible to less horrible to decent. Now, I stated that earlier, Stasis has made its mark in the game and set the precedent for how powerful abilities in the game should be. But my only fear is that Bungie will repeat the same mistake when the other 2 darkness subclasses release in 2021 and 2022's Fall's expansions. Because it's easy to see that Stasis has become so problematic and frustrating to deal with. What if the other 2 subclasses are just as bad, if not worse? Well, everybody, that does it for this one. I hope that you enjoyed this video. In the comment section, tell me how you feel about Stasis and if you've been enjoying Destiny 2 since Stasis made its debut into the game. If you made it to the end of this video and you enjoyed what you watched, do me a favor and thumb rest to that like button until it turns blue. And if you're new to my neck of the woods, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and click that bell icon so you don't ever miss a video of the most elite gaming content. But with that being stated, 1LHD is over and out. Y'all take it easy.
Can redeem you and me. Don't you wanna feel something? And oh, I miss loving you, but I need to live my own too. I wanna feel it all brand new. I found a little something from Miss Angelou. Take the good and hold it near to you, and let go of all that burdens you.